Nobody noticed the old man at Fort Benning that morning. He stood near the back of the parade grounds, gray coveralls stained with years of use, a mop in one hand and a plastic bucket at his feet. His back was slightly bent, his hair thin and white, his face weathered by time and something deeper that most people never bothered to see. The ceremony was about to begin. Rows of soldiers stood at attention under the Georgia sun, their uniforms crisp, their boots polished to a mirror shine. Families filled the bleachers, wives, children, parents, all waiting to celebrate Veterans Appreciation Day. The band warmed up near the stage. Flags snapped in the warm breeze, and the old man mopped. A group of young privates walked past him, barely glancing his way. One of them, a kid named Jenkins with a loud mouth and a louder laugh, nudged his buddy. "Check out Grandpa over there," Jenkins said. "Looks like he missed the retirement home and ended up here instead." His friends snickered. Another private, Torres, shook his head but said nothing. He had a feeling, just a small one, that something about the old man didn't add up. But he kept it to himself. The old man heard them. He always heard them, but his expression didn't change. He just dipped his mop back into the bucket and kept working, slow and steady, like he had all the time in the world. Across the parade grounds, under a white tent reserved for honored guests, a young woman sat alone. She was 24 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and a navy blue dress that looked like she'd bought it just for today. Her name was Emma, and according to the program, she was scheduled to give closing remarks on behalf of her family. Nobody paid much attention to her either. She was just another family member, another name on a list, another 5 minutes of polite applause before everyone could go home. Emma watched the old man from across the field. Her eyes never left him. When Jenkins and his friends laughed, she saw her father's hand tighten around the mop handle. She saw the way he took a slow breath, the way he forced his shoulders to stay relaxed. She knew that look. She had seen it her whole life. The ceremony began with the national anthem. Everyone rose. Hands went to hearts. The old man stopped mopping and stood at attention, perfect attention, his spine suddenly straight, his chin lifted, his heels together. For just a moment, he didn't look like a janitor at all. Torres noticed. He frowned, watching the old man from the corner of his eye. There was something about the way he stood, something that felt familiar. But then the anthem ended, and the old man went back to his mop, and Torres told himself he was imagining things. The battalion commander, Colonel Mitchell, took the stage. He was a tall man with a firm handshake and a voice that carried across the field without a microphone. He welcomed everyone, thanked them for coming, and launched into the usual speech about sacrifice, duty, and honor. "Today we recognize those who gave everything," Mitchell said. "Those who served in silence, who never asked for recognition, who simply did their duty and came home, or didn't come home, without expecting a single thing in return." In the bleachers, Jenkins was already bored. He whispered something to the guy next to him, and they both laughed quietly. A staff sergeant too rose up, shot them a look, and they shut up fast. The speeches continued. A retired general said a few words. A local politician read a proclamation. The crowd clapped politely, checked their watches, and wondered how much longer this would take. Finally, Colonel Mitchell returned to the microphone. "Before we conclude," he said, "we have one more speaker. Please welcome Emma Carter, who will share a few words on behalf of her family." Scattered applause. A few people in the crowd looked at their programs, trying to figure out who Emma Carter was and why she mattered. Most of them shrugged and settled in for another forgettable speech. Emma stood up. She smoothed her dress, took a breath, and walked toward the stage. Her heels clicked against the wooden steps as she climbed up to the podium. She adjusted the microphone, looked out at the sea of faces, soldiers, family, officers, and then her eyes found the old man at the back of the field. He had stopped mopping. He was watching her now, his face unreadable. Emma smiled at him, just a small smile, meant only for him. Then she turned back to the crowd and began to speak. "Good morning," Emma said. Her voice was steady, but there was something in it, a weight, a purpose, that made people sit up a little straighter. "My name is Emma Carter, and I'm here today to talk about my father." She paused, letting the silence settle. "Most of you don't know him. Most of you have never heard his name. And if you saw him today, which many of you did, you probably didn't give him a second thought." In the crowd, a few people exchanged confused glances. Jenkins smirked and whispered to Torres, "What is she talking about?" Torres didn't answer. He was watching Emma with a growing sense of unease. "My father is here today," Emma continued. "He's been here all morning, actually. But he's not sitting in the VIP section. He's not wearing a uniform covered in ribbons. He's not shaking hands with generals." She pointed toward the back of the field. "He's over there, with a mop." Every head in the crowd turned. 1,000 eyes landed on the old man in gray coveralls, standing alone near his bucket, the mop still in his hand. Jenkins felt his stomach drop. Torres closed his eyes and muttered something under his breath. "My father's name is Master Sergeant William Carter, United States Army, retired," Emma said. "He served for 31 years. He completed 6 combat deployments, 2 to Vietnam, 2 to the Gulf, and 2 more that are still classified to this day." The parade grounds had gone completely silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. He was awarded the Silver Star twice. He received the Bronze Star with Valor. He earned 3 Purple Hearts, 1 for each time he was wounded protecting the soldiers under his command. Emma's voice didn't waver. She had practiced this speech 100 times in her head, but now that she was saying it out loud, it felt like the words were speaking themselves. When he retired, there was no parade, no ceremony. He didn't want one. He just came home, kissed my mother, and started looking for ways to stay useful. That's how he ended up here, volunteering as a janitor at the same base where he once trained soldiers to survive. In the VIP section, Colonel Mitchell had gone pale. He was staring at the old man, at Master Sergeant William Carter, with an expression of pure shock. "He never told anyone who he was," Emma said. "He never corrected the soldiers who laughed at him. He never demanded respect. Because my father believes that respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn. And he earned it a long time ago, in places most of us will never see, doing things most of us will never understand." She reached into the folder she had carried to the podium, and pulled out a photograph. She held it up so everyone could see. It was a picture of a young soldier in jungle fatigues, standing in front of a helicopter. He was covered in mud and blood, but he was smiling, his arm around another soldier who looked barely conscious. The photo was old, faded, cracked at the edges, but the face was unmistakable. It was the janitor, 40 years younger, but the same man. "This was taken in 1971, Emma said. "My father had just carried 3 wounded men through 2 miles of enemy territory to reach an extraction point. He was shot twice during that march. He never stopped moving." Jenkins looked like he was going to be sick. His face had gone white, and he couldn't stop staring at the old man, who still hadn't moved, who still stood there with his mop like nothing had changed. "I'm not telling you this to make anyone feel bad," Emma said. "I'm telling you this because my father would never tell you himself. He doesn't believe in bragging. He doesn't believe in making a fuss. He believes in showing up, doing the work, and letting his actions speak for themselves." She set the photograph down and gripped the edges of the podium. "So the next time you see someone who doesn't look important, someone in old clothes, someone doing a job you think is beneath you, maybe take a second look. Maybe ask yourself what their story is, because you never know who you're standing next to." The silence that followed Emma's words was absolute. No one moved. No one whispered. 1,000 people sat frozen in place, processing what they had just heard. Then, slowly, Colonel Mitchell rose from his seat. He walked down from the stage, his boots loud against the wooden steps. Every eye followed him as he crossed the parade grounds, past the rows of soldiers, past the families in the bleachers, all the way to the back of the field where the old man stood. Master Sergeant William Carter watched him approach. His face was still calm, still unreadable, but there was something in his eyes now, a flicker of emotion he had spent a lifetime learning to hide. Colonel Mitchell stopped 3 feet in front of him. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Mitchell snapped to attention and rendered the sharpest salute of his career. "Master Sergeant Carter," he said, his voice carrying across the silent field. "It is an honor, sir." The old man looked at him, really looked at him, and something shifted in his expression. The mask cracked, just a little. His eyes glistened. Slowly, carefully, he set down his mop. He straightened his spine, pulled his shoulders back, and returned the salute with a precision that hadn't faded in all his years away from uniform. Behind Mitchell, something extraordinary began to happen. One by one, the soldiers in formation began to turn. Without orders, without commands, They pivoted on their heels and faced the back of the field. Junior enlisted, NCOs, officers, rank didn't matter anymore. They all turned toward the old man, and then they saluted. All of them, every single one. Jenkins was crying. He didn't even realize it at first. The tears just came, streaming down his face as he held his salute with trembling arms. Torres stood beside him, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the man he had dismissed as a nobody just an hour ago. In the bleachers, families rose to their feet. Some of them saluted too, veterans, mostly men and women who understood what they were witnessing. Others simply stood in respectful silence, hands over their hearts. Emma watched from the stage, tears streaming down her face. She had known this moment would come. She had planned it, rehearsed it, dreamed about it, but nothing could have prepared her for actually seeing it. Her father, the man who had never asked for anything, surrounded by 1,000 people giving him everything. Master Sergeant Carter held his salute for a long moment. Then, slowly, he lowered his hand. He looked out at the sea of faces, young soldiers, old veterans, families he had never met, and for the first time in years, he didn't know what to say. So he just nodded. A simple nod, the kind he had given 1,000 times before. The kind that said more than words ever could. Colonel Mitchell stepped forward and extended his hand. "Sir, would you do us the honor of joining us on the stage?" Carter looked at the hand, then at the stage, then back at Mitchell. For a moment, it seemed like he might refuse. He had never wanted any of this. He had spent his whole life avoiding exactly this kind of attention. But then he saw Emma, standing at the podium with tears in her eyes and pride written across her face. His little girl, all grown up, who had somehow found a way to give him the recognition he had never sought. He couldn't say no to her. He never could. "All right," he said quietly. "Lead the way, Colonel." The walk across the parade grounds felt like it took forever. Master Sergeant Carter moved slowly, his old bones protesting every step, but he kept his back straight and his head high. Colonel Mitchell walked beside him, matching his pace, treating him like the honored guest he should have been from the beginning. As they passed through the formation, soldiers reached out to shake his hand. Some of them couldn't speak. Their throats were too tight, their emotions too raw. They just gripped his weathered fingers and nodded, hoping he could feel what they couldn't say. Carter accepted each handshake with grace. He looked every soldier in the eye, gave them that small nod, and kept moving. By the time he reached the stage, his hand ached from all the gripping, but he didn't mind. This was what service meant. This was why he had given 31 years of his life to the uniform. Not for medals, not for recognition. For moments like this, moments of connection, of shared understanding, of brotherhood that transcended rank and age and time. Emma met him at the bottom of the steps. She threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest, and for a long moment they just held each other. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she whispered. Carter's voice was rough when he answered. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart. Always have been." They climbed the steps together. Colonel Mitchell guided them to the center of the stage, where a single chair had been placed, a chair that had been empty all morning, waiting for this moment. "Please," Mitchell said, gesturing to the seat. "Sit, Master Sergeant. You've earned it." Carter looked at the chair, then at the crowd. Every face was turned toward him. Every eye was watching. He had spent his entire career avoiding the spotlight, doing his job in the shadows, letting others take the credit. Now there was nowhere to hide. He sat down. Mitchell returned to the podium. He cleared his throat, visibly composing himself, and addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I owe you, and Master Sergeant Carter, an apology. We failed today. We failed to recognize one of the finest soldiers this army has ever produced. A man who served with distinction for over 3 decades. A man who saved countless lives and never asked for a single thing in return." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "Master Sergeant Carter represents everything we aspire to be. Humble, dedicated, selfless. He could have spent his retirement on a beach somewhere, enjoying the peace he earned. Instead, he came back here, to this base, to these soldiers, and continued to serve in whatever way he could." Mitchell turned to face Carter directly. "Sir, on behalf of the United States Army, and on behalf of every soldier who has ever worn the uniform, thank you. Thank you for your sacrifice. Thank you for your service. And thank you for reminding us what true honor looks like." The applause that followed was deafening. It rolled across the parade grounds like thunder, wave after wave of gratitude and respect. Soldiers cheered. Families stood on their feet. The band started playing, but no one could hear the music over the roar of the crowd. Carter sat in his chair, overwhelmed. He had been shot at, bombed, ambushed, and left for dead more times than he could count. None of that had prepared him for this. Emma stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder. She leaned down and whispered in his ear, "You deserve this, Dad. Every bit of it." He reached up and squeezed her hand. "I know, sweetheart, I know." After the ceremony, there was a reception in the base community center. Long tables covered with white cloths held trays of sandwiches, cookies, and punch bowls that nobody touched. Everyone was too busy trying to talk to Master Sergeant Carter. He sat at a table near the window, Emma beside him, as a steady stream of soldiers came to pay their respects. Some of them brought photos, old pictures of units he had served with, missions he had led, men he had saved. Carter studied each one carefully, his memory reaching back through the decades. "I remember this," he said, holding up a faded image of a group of soldiers standing in front of a burned-out building. "Kandahar, 2003. We lost 2 good men that day." The young sergeant who had brought the photo nodded solemnly. "My father was in that unit, sir. He always talked about you, said you were the best NCO he ever served under." Carter handed back the photo. "Your father was a good soldier. How's he doing now?" "He passed away 3 years ago, sir. Cancer." Carter's face softened. "I'm sorry to hear that, son. He was a brave man." The sergeant swallowed hard. "Thank you, sir. It means a lot, coming from you." This went on for hours. Soldier after soldier, story after story. Carter listened to all of them, shook every hand, answered every question. He was exhausted, his old body begging for rest, but he refused to leave until the last person had been heard. Near the end of the reception, Jenkins appeared. He approached the table slowly, his head down, his hands shaking. He looked like a man walking to his own execution. "Master Sergeant Carter, sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I need to apologize." Carter looked at him calmly. "For what, son?" Jenkins couldn't meet his eyes. "For this morning. For what I said. I didn't know. I didn't." He trailed off, unable to finish. Carter studied him for a long moment. Then he reached out and put a hand on Jenkins' shoulder. "Look at me, son." Jenkins forced himself to look up. His eyes were red, his face streaked with dried tears. "You made a mistake," Carter said. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what you do next. You learn from it. You do better. You treat every person you meet with the respect they deserve, not because of what they look like or what job they do, but because they're human beings. Can you do that?" Jenkins nodded frantically. "Yes, sir. I swear, sir. I'll never." "Good." Carter squeezed his shoulder, then let go. "Now stop crying and go get something to eat. You look like you're about to pass out." A shaky laugh escaped Jenkins' lips. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." He walked away, wiping his face, and Carter watched him go with something like satisfaction. Emma leaned over. "That was kind of you." Carter shrugged. "He's young. He'll learn. We all had to learn. Did you ever make mistakes like that, when you were his age?" Carter was quiet for a moment. "More than I care to remember," he finally said. "But I had people who set me straight. Good NCOs, good officers, good friends. They didn't give up on me, even when I probably deserved it. So I don't give up on kids like him." Emma smiled. "That's why you're here, isn't it? Why you volunteer at the base instead of just retiring?" Carter looked out the window at the parade grounds, now empty except for a few workers taking down the bleachers. "These young soldiers," he said slowly, "they're good kids. Most of them. They just need guidance. They need someone to show them the way. And if an old man with a mop can do that, even just a little bit, then maybe all those years meant something." Emma took his hand. "They meant everything, Dad. Don't ever doubt that." 6 months later, a package arrived at the Carter household. Emma was visiting for the weekend when her father opened it. Inside was a letter and a small wooden box. The letter was from Jenkins. He had been promoted to specialist and was about to deploy overseas for the first time. He wrote that he thought about Master Sergeant Carter every day, about that moment at the ceremony, about the lesson he had learned, about the man who had shown him grace when he deserved none. "I'm going to make you proud, sir," the letter said. "I'm going to be the kind of soldier you were, the kind who leads by example, the kind who never judges a book by its cover. Thank you for giving me a second chance." Inside the wooden box was a challenge coin, a custom design Jenkins had commissioned himself. On one side was the Army insignia. On the other was a simple image, a mop crossed with a rifle, and the words, "True Honor," engraved beneath. Carter held the coin in his palm, feeling its weight. His eyes were wet, but he was smiling. "Well," he said quietly, "how about that?" Emma read the letter over his shoulder, her own eyes glistening. He remembered, "Dad, you changed his life." Carter nodded slowly. "Maybe. Or maybe he changed it himself. I just gave him a nudge." He set the coin on the mantel, next to his silver stars and his bronze star and his purple hearts, all the medals he had never displayed, all the honors he had kept hidden in a drawer for decades. Emma had insisted on putting them out after the ceremony, and for once, he hadn't argued. "You know," he said, still looking at the medals, "I spent 31 years thinking the mission was everything. Complete the objective, protect your men, come home alive. That was it. That was all that mattered." He turned to face his daughter. "But I was wrong. The mission doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It just changes. You find new ways to serve, new people to help, new lessons to teach." Emma hugged him tightly. "You're still teaching, Dad. Every single day." Carter held her close, this daughter who had somehow understood him better than he understood himself. "I guess I am," he said. "I guess I am." Outside, the sun was setting over the Georgia hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Somewhere on a base far away, a young soldier was preparing for his first deployment, carrying a challenge coin in his pocket and a lesson in his heart. And in a small house on a quiet street, an old man with a mop, a hero in coveralls, sat with his daughter and watched the light fade, grateful for every moment, every memory, every second chance. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss another powerful story. And tell us in the comments, have you ever misjudged someone and later discovered who they really were? We'd love to hear your story.